You created the drought artificially, knowing that that would be the end result, that all the storage facilities up and down the Mississippi would get chock-a-block completely full, that these grain shuttles would unload on the banks, and then they would cover them with temporary tarp. But then if you knew that would be the full Mississippi up and down for 150, 200 miles of just grain stacked up, covered by tarp, then all of a sudden you send the biggest flood in 100 years down during the spring melt season and wash all that away. So that is actually one of my calls for 2023. All that grain stored on the Mississippi because of low water levels will be washed away in a mega flood this spring. And I never said anything about geoengineering, but I thought I would because you did.
Welcome to the feature interview for today. I'm Mike Adams, and our special guest today is David Dubine, and his channel is called Adapt 2030. He's also a host on Brighteon.tv every other Friday at 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's a free stream to catch there. And he's also got the Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. He's an analyst of global trends in food, fertilizer, crop production. Thank you for joining me. This is going to be great. Another thought in all of this is that farmers that fail to be able to plant crops, often on marginal land that you were just talking about, they could still run cattle on that land because, of course, the cattle do their own foraging, and the cattle can walk around, ruts and erosion or craters or what have you, right? They do their own thing. I could see a lot of situations where farmers, maybe they can't grow alfalfa this year or soybeans or corn, but they might run cattle for a season or two, at least in the United States. But in Europe, they don't even have that option in many places now, like the Netherlands, where they're shutting down thousands of farms. So they're taking away one more option from a farmer.
It is. And you talked about in the Ukraine, imagine how much fence has already been installed in Ukraine because they have, a lot of animal husbandry there. You got tanks and battle vehicles going through, ripping down, hundreds and thousands of miles of fence.
Sure.
That's not an easy task to put it back up again in a matter of minutes. It takes a bit of time to ring that back in.
True. Yeah, that's a really good point. You're exactly right. Fencing and fence maintenance is key to raising livestock, but also then irrigation and the availability of water, which brings us back to the geoengineering because you saw over this last summer, right, that intense heat wave and drought in Kansas and Oklahoma. And we've had, of course, bad droughts in Texas over the years. And when that happens, man, the ranchers just sell off entire herds, or 80 to 85% of their herds. And they just keep the best genetic specimens to kind of regrow the herds next year. But they can't maintain the current population because there's no grass, there's no water. And then hay bales, feed. A big round bale can end up costing like $500 or some insane number or more in these droughts. And that's all geoengineering. And it seems like that's accelerating too.
Yeah, because that was also spoken about at that dairy conference that I attended and spoke at, was cattle genetics and then feed efficiency. Because it's going to come down literally to grams of food into the cattle to try to, when we come into these food lean times, and they're going to have to make a choice like they did in England, say 1550 to 1700, on which types of animals. You saw a rollover and a changeover from cattle into pig and sheep/goat. Because they were smaller, they could wild forage a lot better than a cow can, and there was less input into it. And that lasted for 100 plus years. And then you could see the roll out of that too, where they started gravitating back toward cattle again once food production became more bountiful after the natural cycle had run its course.
Well, that's interesting. And also, given local production, a lot of people are using rabbits, for example, as a meat source. Food experts like Marjorie Wildcraft talk about that, raising your own rabbits for food, feeding them garden scraps, and then harvesting the rabbits for meat. That you can't get any more local than your backyard. You're a hutch full of rabbits to skin and cook up, I guess, in a stew. I can't do that, but a lot of people are doing that, and it definitely is a survival resource.
It is. And you got to think about, these redundancies and the frugality. I mean, yeah, you could go shoot your squirrels every day and, put out your safe traps and catch something every night. I swear to you, 100% of nights that we would put a safe trap out, there would be something in it in the morning, 100% of the time. instead of trying to use snare traps, just use those little safe traps that the front snaps down on
the
it.
live
And
catch, like the raccoon
you're
trap.
always going to get something in it.
Yeah, but not necessarily something you want to eat.
That's right.
Armadillos and such. It's like,
I've eaten an armadillo. I was down in, where's that, in Costa Rica, and they had armadillo, and Guatemala. They also had armadillo, and I tried it a few times. It was pretty, had a zingy taste to it. That's the best way I can describe it. Zingy meat.
Okay. Not sure I want that for breakfast, but like a little armadillo burrito breakfast.
Layer it on the oatmeal. We're all good.
Yeah, right. Extra gravy makes everything go down, or just add wild boar bacon. But okay, what else can people do? The folks who are listening here, and they're well informed, and they have a good sense of what's coming. But in terms of a practical series of steps locally to secure a sustainable food supply, not just stockpiling food, but getting involved in local agriculture and so on, what can people do to live, to help support an area that produces food on an ongoing basis?
First, find the people that are doing the same thing already, so you're not starting from scratch and having to reinvent the wheel. There are people everywhere that are doing this, and the awareness over the last 2 years or so has really pushed a lot of people into action in local areas. You're always going to find a local community garden or somebody who's doing chickens like we are, or growing their own food, animal, like you say, raising rabbits. Sometimes they raise guinea pigs. Again, it's not my thing, but there's a lot of options. People have goats, sheep, that sort of thing. If you have enough land, you could fence in or use somebody who already has fenced in land and let maybe your cow run over there and have a cow share. But again, we saw that, bad Amish, can't let people have raw milk. But it's going to come down to the locality again. I really believe that it's going to be the trading of skills. Everybody's got a different skill. The combining of skills that could be used to improve output, or just straight up like a dentist. If a dentist is in your community that would be willing to trade you dental time for a task such as setting up their garden or planning out their garden or a food forest or whatnot, something familiar with food, a fish pond, whatever it is, to be able to move people and enhance their lives and make their transition into this new world that we're moving into more comfortable and more secure in the mind. Because if you have a food forest in your front yard and backyard that looks like any other bunch of plants, so somebody who didn't really know wild foraging or plants would walk right by it, which is probably 95% of the population.
True.
So these things to give yourself longevity of security and longevity of peace of mind is really what's going to be key. The short-term wins, applaud it, yay. But you're really going to need to be looking out past replacing what you use, because if we're going to go into this breakdown of supply chains, you're not going to be able to go to the store and get it. You're going to have to regrow it or replace it yourself season after season after season. And then hope everything improves in the next 10 or 15 years and we get back to some sort of normal.
Right. And hope it's not highly irradiated croplands for the next 100 years following a thermonuclear war. I mean, that's the other part of this is, look at Russia and the conflicts there, and the risk of nuclear weapons being used or nuclear terrorism as maybe a false flag justification for war. And think about what that's going to do, David, to the available croplands. If you have a nuclear event in eastern Ukraine and the wind is blowing westward, you've just rendered all of Ukraine unfarmable for, 300 years, something like that, from cesium-137 fallout. A similar thing with the east coast of the United States, right? If you get the Poseidon secret Russian nuclear underwater unmanned submarine doomsday weapon, and that goes off, and you get this radioactive tidal wave that hits the East Coast, well, guess what? There's going to be radioactive water vapor in the air falling across all of the United States as well. It's not just water fallout, it's radioactive water fallout. It's like they can ruin the whole world just like that. And there's madmen at the helm right now. This is the problem.
Yeah, and add in, several thousand tons of depleted uranium rounds or whatever it might be, and then you're just adding to that contamination, because you can't tell me looking around over in Iraq how much DU we put down there, and you're going to tell me that they're still going to farm after all the depleted uranium was splattered all over the place and
Right.
across the entire country.
Yeah.
I hope it doesn't come to that point. If you wake up in the news in the morning and that truly has happened, where there was some sort of device over the Ukraine, or Kazakhstan would be another one, we are literally going to have a famine that same year. That's really like biblical scary type of, end times type of thing there on the famines. And by the way, I was looking at a couple predictions for the year, and here was one: economic disaster. The prices will get so high in wheat that man will eat man.
Ooh.
Meaning the failed economy leads to cannibalism. And I'm already looking at a zero, barely functioning supply chain, no fertilizers, no pesticides, few herbicides, and honey shall cost far more than candle wax. So I'm sitting here going, we're getting pretty close to that. A few more moves on the chessboard and we'll be right there. Where then again, it's biblical. You talk about, what was that, a day's wage for a loaf of bread, something like this.
Well,
That's what you would expect after that detonation over that. A day's wage for a loaf of bread.
Wow. You just mentioned cannibalism. So very concerning trend to see, but there's been in the media a lot of talk of cannibalism over the last year or so. And it sounds crazy, but this is the world that we appear to be going into. And I have the question for you about, cities versus rural living. So if you're in a city and we suffer a catastrophic breakdown of diesel fuel or transportation, then you're in a food desert instantly. Where if you're in a rural area and you've had connections with local farmers and producers of some kind, and you have some surface water, you got some ponds and streams and so on, you have options. I mean, they may not be pleasant, but you have options. But if you're in the city, you're eating your neighbor, sadly, that's what it seems like it's going to come to, unless the global supply chain is fixed here.
Yeah, and that's a great point you brought up, because, for me, there's lines I will never cross. But at the same time, if somebody's coming in, a group of people are coming to rob your supplies and overtake you in your home, there's lines you're going to have to draw for yourself mentally before any of this happens. And I already know where a lot of my lines are in terms of light versus this dark vibration, where we sit in this battle between, literal good and evil. And I've drawn lines everywhere, and I will not cross so many of them. Regardless of what happens to me, there's just some things that are, there's things I will never, ever do.
Yeah, but
you got to be ready to make those choices already.
Other people will cross those lines because we live in a very immoral society, right? So, and I know you realize that. I'm just pointing it out that even though you're not willing to eat your neighbor, your neighbors are probably willing to eat you, right? So,
well, that's where we're going to have a problem. And that's enough.
Exactly. Try to live near reasonable people who are preppers.
Well, I'm moving into the neighborhood near you, because you'd have to think, on top of that lead poisoning inside, it'd be cesium poisoning, radiation poisoning inside the flesh too. Like, if you get to that point, the hygiene standards would be so low. And I'm sure, Mike, you can attest to way more than I can. If your hygiene gets to a certain point, then your body doesn't function any longer. Your mind doesn't either. At what point can you let hygiene go until it becomes a serious mental and physical health issue?
You make a point, which is, because I've done a lot of lab testing. I've tested a lot of human hair versus wild animal hair, for example, for heavy metals. And I can tell you that human hair, even my own, is way more contaminated than wild rabbit hair, which I have tested, and wild hog hair that I've also tested, because, I found animals on the ranch, and I clip some hair, take it to the lab, and I test it, right? And wild animals are very clean compared to people. The disease, the contamination, the microplastics, everything. And plus, again, I'm sorry that this is such a dark topic, but these days, half the people are protein factories. Like, do you even want to get close to them? They're shedding protein all over the place, which the wild animals are not yet. But these are conversations that are not going to be unusual in another year.
Yeah, and look at that, the redundancy too, medical gear. And, we talked a bit before the show. I roll with a pretty big med kit in my car because I'm out in farm country. I've been hurt on my own land where I needed stitches and I didn't have the proper gear. I've had somebody else out here cut themselves deeply that needed stitches. I've rolled by some dudes who were chainsawing and had a severe accident out there, and this thing, a part of the log fell on his foot, even though he had a boot. It scraped through the boot and ripped part of it, like the top layer of his skin off. Like, luckily I was driving by. And then I saw another guy with an accident. Some kids pulled out in front of this old timer. Cool guy. He was in his 70s, and his hand was all mangled up. But I had stuff to be able to offer right there to help another human. But it got wet. I had an emergency bottle of water in a glass bottle, and during that super freeze, it broke, and I didn't even think about that. And I came out, and there was water all on the bottom of the car, and I thought, where? What? And my whole medical bag was completely saturated. So, Mike, this is a question for you. I got the non-stick pads and these sort of things. Those dried out really well. And then I have, large bandages, and then I got transparent film dressing, the 4-inch by 4.75 inch. Those dried out pretty well. But I got a lot of Band-Aids too, like butterfly bandages and these types of things in a regular boo-boo kit, like that kind of Band-Aid. What happens after they get wet and you put them in a food dehydrator like I did? I let them dry for about 6 hours on 135 degrees Fahrenheit to try to dry all my med kit out again. Non-stick pads for compresses, those all dried out pretty well.
Well, the bandages, as long as the packaging is still intact, they should still be sterile. However, the adhesive may have gone into the water solution, and the adhesive may no longer be on the bandage. It may be on the inside of the package. So it might be useless if you need adhesive qualities.
So I just use tape, regular medical tape, to wrap it around and stick it on instead of the adhesive itself.
Yeah, a lot of those bandages are not that great anyway. It's good to have sterile gauze and then medical tape. Stronger bandaging type of materials. But I would suggest you replace that supply. If it got soaked and you had to dry it out, you probably can't trust whether it's sterile. The packaging is probably not trustworthy at this point. But also, I carry extra water too, but I carry it in these large aluminum 1-liter bottles. They're aluminum, so they can expand and contract, and they don't shatter. And that's been okay. I also recommend, of course, having a small camping water filter in your vehicle, with a pump, so you can pump some water and clean it as needed. But it's interesting that you rolled up on some people who had some serious accidents and chainsaw accidents. I was just talking about that the other day. Let me ask you, David, have you ever run over yourself with a snowplow?
No, never.
Okay, that's good. That's good, because someone famous just did that recently, and did not go well. Neighbors saved him by applying a tourniquet, got him into the ER, and he's fighting for survival there. But in these rural situations, people injure themselves all the time with chainsaws and tractors and combines and dozers and whatever else. Injuries are incredibly common, even with just like hunting knives. People stab themselves in the hands all the time, opening avocados and things like that. So folks, be safety minded about all this stuff. This is not a time to end up in the emergency room.
Can I ask you one last question about
sure,
blood for a second? Yeah, like if you were to come up on a person, say the snowplow person, and they were bleeding out like that, and you just didn't have a chance to get to latex gloves, what is the contamination risk factor there of actually going in and that barehanded just to get the tourniquet on to stabilize that and stop the bleeding compared to your own protection of somebody else's blood?
Well, me personally, I would go ahead and rush in and get my hands bloody if necessary to apply the tourniquet. I wouldn't worry about it. But that's only because, I've got a lot of knowledge of how to detox and I've got a good immune system and so on. But if you have open wounds or scrapes of any kind, obviously you could get contaminated, quite badly. But if I had latex gloves, I'd put them on. But if I didn't have time, if the guy's femoral artery is pumping, gushing, I'm not going to look for gloves. I'm going to go in there, clamp down on above the wound. Basically, I'm going to be squeezing the guy's leg like high up in the crotch area, strapping a belt on there, finding a stick, twisting that sucker, or anything I can do to make it crazy tight. That's what I'm going to do. I don't care if I get bloody.
Okay, that's valuable knowledge right there.
Yeah. Or, take your shirt off, make like a linear bundle of cotton out of a t-shirt or something, wrap that around, put a stick in it, twist that up. And remember, you got to twist it until the person basically is screaming in pain. It has to be
Yeah.
so crazy tight that you think like his leg's going to fall off. But that's the only way to stop, because the blood pressure through that artery, it's a big artery. It's the biggest. And the only way to stop the blood is to make it insanely tight to where the person is probably screaming at you and begging you to stop. But there you go.
Yeah, and I hope our medical facilities still continue to run, because, right now we have the blessed option of a first world problem of, oh, you might have to wait in line when you get there, but at least you can get them to better medical care that can generally, I'm going to say generally, fix that. But what happens if we're in a breakdown scenario where then you're there and you can't take them anywhere else? Then what?
Yeah.
After you put tourniquet and everything
Right.
on, then what? I mean, we've done these battle injuries in like the Civil War and thing. What are they going to bite the belt and then you're going to shove an arrow through there with gunpowder on it, or what?
No, I'm not going to try that. No.
You know what I mean?
Right. But yeah, if you lose 40% of your blood and there's no ER, not a good outcome. Be careful with chainsaws and blades and machinery.
There's going to be way more injuries just from me working on the farm. You can attest to this, Mike, as well. Like, how many hand cut injuries do you get? Unless you're wearing gloves all the time, that things sticking in you, barbs coming through, sometimes, different briars and things. They're just going to get stuck by thorns and anything plus cuts. Your hands get really cut, and so does your face sometimes, because things come slapping back at you, whipping back.
Oh, that is true.
Yeah. Knee, shin cuts, all this kind of stuff. You're going to get way more cut, way more injured working out on the farm tools and even planting a simple garden.
That's true. I get scraped, cut my skin open just walking by a fence opening where there was a piece of wire still sticking out from the original fence construction, right? That could have been bent back into a rounded shape, but it was sticking out. So that happens. And then you add animals to the mix, like you're trying to load horses or load donkeys or load cattle into a trailer. Now you have real injury potential, getting stomped on, breaking hands, elbows, arms, all kinds of stuff like that. So that's why the real cowboys are some tough dudes. They are tough. They can get it done and walk away.
Yeah, can you imagine? You just pop the whole visual in there trying to get animal loaded. Oh, they're so heavy and so fast.
Yep, strong, motivated, and in Texas we have
Yeah, they're
longhorns
motivated
everywhere.
to get away from you. Like, how motivated are we to get away from the system? Because those animals are motivated to get away. We need to be that motivated to get away from the system and get off centralized delivery immediately.
Right. While the world governments are trying to corral us, it's a race for survival.
I'd written a note to myself when you and I were talking about geoengineering. If you were to orchestrate a heat wave like you're talking about with HARP technologies, because I also saw this news story that just came out this week. We're going to use the HARP facility in Alaska to bombard or, send signals to a passing asteroid and try to affect its orbit somehow using HARP from Earth to actually target an object in space. So if they're at that potential where they're actually going outer atmosphere, literally leaving our ionosphere out into space to target an object, how difficult would it be to blast it to create a heat wave or, a high pressure system around an area? It's been so drought ridden in the West for so long that it's affecting Mississippi River, water levels now, where they couldn't even export the crop that we had this year. They were at the end of the export season, they were stymied because the water levels weren't high enough. Yeah. Now, they unloaded all that grain along the banks of the Mississippi River. Now, how easy would it be to now create a huge, massive deluge and wash all those stored grains downstream during the season in spring? Just saying. It can go either direction, creating a rain or creating drought. You created the drought artificially, knowing that would be the end result, that all the storage facilities up and down the Mississippi would get chock-a-block completely full, that these grain shuttles would unload on the banks, and then they would cover them with temporary tarp. But then if you knew that would be the full Mississippi up and down for 150, 200 miles of just grain stacked up, covered by tarp, then all of a sudden you send the biggest flood in 100 years down during the spring melt season and wash all that away. And then, that's just nasty right there. And I've been looking at the possibilities of that happening. So that is actually one of my calls for 2023. All that grain stored on the Mississippi because of low water levels will be washed away in a mega flood this spring. And I never said anything about geoengineering, but I thought I would because you did.
Well, and of course, if that happens, the media will blame it on climate change, which is absurd.
Course.
And then they'll say, this is why we need to make sure there are no tractors that run on combustion engines. So they'll use the crisis to further attack the food supply and impair farming, crop yield potential. So it's going to get interesting, and people are going to get hungry. And the good news is a lot of people are going to learn how to grow food.
It's a hopeful time for humanity to pull together to come through some of this darkness that is overshadowing us.
I would say to our audience, just stay alert, be prepared. I want to make sure people can find you. Your channel name is called Adapt 2030, and you're on Brighteon.com and other platforms. And you've also got the Brighteon.tv broadcasts every other Friday, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. What else do you want to mention, David?
Well, that's it. And I've also started the Opportunity Report. It's a subscription service for comparing pre and post eruptive data from the Hunga Tonga eruption and where that's cooling on our planet first, which crop zones are being affected most, and where you would expect the greatest losses in grains to be. So if they're a major exporter, then you could anticipate for social unrest to start first in the poorer, 100% reliant import nations, and then you can make a whole list of that.
All right, where do people get that report?
Well, the report right now is by request, or if I think that, it might help your business or your firm help us move through these problems and find solutions together, because once you see where the problem areas are, solutions will come out. Where there's a need for a solution, it will arise. I really firmly believe that.
So how can people contact you to request this report?
You can write an email, send it to podcast@oilseedcrops.org.
Okay.
And that's based off the Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast, podcast@oilseedcrops.org. If you have a business and a need for this information, that's who I'm targeting it towards. Somebody who has the resources that can actuate on the resources to put solutions in play immediately to help us get through this. Thanks for letting me ramble. Thank you, Mike.
No, it's all good, David. Thanks for being willing to talk about just about anything here. Nevertheless, it's a strange world. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, David, for joining. Of course, I'm Mike Adams, the founder of Brighteon.com. So